It's a little bit after 6 p.m., so we will commence the special study session of the council. Everybody should have received a memo on their email, which has been printed out. It's here. And then there's another PowerPoint printout that's here. So we're going to get this started, but before we do, I have one question that I want to
Everybody has to
point out. Is we're here to talk about a financial forecast, and we just passed a budget in November for 2023. And it was my assumption that that budget that we went over with different study sessions, different committee meetings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, was fully funded and balanced. But here we are now, hearing something other than that. So that is the question I want to throw out there to begin with. And if we can get some of that explained, that would be great.
You're gonna have to share the.
Yeah, right. Oh.
And do we have Marvin on?
No.
Okay, I just wanted to see if we had him. Okay.
I will.
Have to share my.
No, we
No,
got
we
it.
got it.
We got it.
We
We're
got it.
flipping a coin of who's going to answer.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Oh, wait. I don't have a red light. Am I not on?
Hello,
You should be on.
I guess I get to answer it.
By
Um,
default, I guess.
yeah. So the 2023 budget is balanced. It was balanced using some one-time funds. So what we have done for the 6-year forecast is identify the one-time funds. And later on, we'll talk a little bit more about balancing 1 year at a time, which I think historically is what the city has done versus taking this approach, which is looking ahead to make sure that our revenues meet our expenditures. So we're not using one-time funds to balance a budget.
Yes. So I would just add, the financial forecast is not to address 2023 and balance or rebalance 23 budget is the basis to jump off to inform 24 and 6 years going forward to say, if we kept our current levels of service and we assume a certain revenue and expenditure growth assumptions, what is 24's budget going to look like? Knowing that we balanced 23 with one-time funds, which means we were already in a deficit for 23. We want to get a jump on what's 24 going to look like. And again, not wanting to only balance 1 year at a time, because then you're just kind of either kicking the can down the road or not addressing the underlying issues. So we wanted to put a 6-year forecast together to say, starting from 23, what does 24 look like and beyond, so that we can make choices now to better align us to have a balanced budget in the future. So we're not trying to rebalance or balance 23. 23 is balanced and done.
So is it fair to say that the one-time funds were the ARPA funds?
They were ARPA
Recouping
funds,
from,
some ARPA funds, the PSC easement contributions was a large part of it. And then some just one-time cash that paid for one-time projects and equipment, which is pretty standard when you have a one-time thing to just use the cash available balance for that. So kind of a combination of all three of those things.
any questions from the council regarding the explanation of why we're here? Councilmember.
Was that at the start, was that the Miller Park where we were talking about where we moved those funds?
Yep.
Was that the Miller Park funds we had moved when we were talking about the budget at the start, or we were?
I think
I'm
that
not
was
sure.
for the city hall remodel and REIT dollars. No, the way that we balanced this year was use of the PSC dollars, which went into the general fund,
Mhm.
as well as some one-time ARPA dollars. And we always carry a balance in the general fund. And so we drew down from that existing balance in the general fund,
Gotcha.
but nothing with Miller Park. I
No,
don't,
I was remembering at the start, during the budget process, there was something to do with permit fees or something that we had in the wrong spot, and then we had to take, so we couldn't do all Miller Park at once. You remember what I'm talking about?
Well, there was the issue of the latecomers that was, I think, in the wrong spot from the revenue,
It
but
was.
that wasn't related to Miller Park. I think Miller Park, we talked about it from the standpoint of we phased it in, knowing we couldn't do it all in 23 or 23 anyways. We put in like the Bevlo Street extension pieces first, and the dirt work type stuff, type infrastructure stuff first. And yes, pushed construction out because of not having enough REIT to do it all in 1 year and
Yeah,
capacity.
I was just trying to remember.
Okay.
That's-
Mhm.
Thank you.
I had to go back and think about that.
Any other questions regarding the 23 budget? Hearing and seeing none, let's go forward.
Okay. No, that's okay. Is it showing? Yeah. It's not up yet. It's trying. There we go. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm not. Okay, well, good. We're on to the first slide. So, good evening, council. Thank you for coming. I know it's a special meeting night, so we appreciate that. Wanted to have plenty of time to talk about this topic. Again, we are talking about a 24 to 29 6-year forecast. Wanting to project out how our levels of service will look going forward, making either no changes or with obviously needing some changes. So for tonight's agenda, we're going to be looking at the forecast. We have 2 that were included in your packet, a baseline forecast and a scenario 1, and I'll go through what those both mean. Then we'll talk kind of about what's the toolbox, what options do council have to address the deficit, whether that's councilmanic, which means council has the choice to increase or add, voter approved. Obviously, if you have to go to the voters, some one-time resources, some other revenue sources that we'll address with the departments, expenditure review, and then just kind of talk about next steps, council's direction, and then obviously questions and discussion about. Would be happy to take questions as we go. If council wants to get in depth on something as we go, that would be great. If we want to wait to get into specific topics at the end, whatever council would prefer to choose, we are accommodating to that. Okay. So the baseline forecast. So a forecast really has to start from someplace. So we start from the 23 adopted budget, since that is the most recent one that we adopted, and we balanced it. We know we balanced it using one-time funds, so that we did have a deficit, an ongoing deficit. When you look at your ongoing revenue sources to your ongoing expenditures, that's really what we're trying to look at. So there's some things we have to do to that budget to see what that looks like going forward, because of one-time expenses that you don't want to carry forward. So we built it based on the 23 adopted budget. One-time expenses that were included in 23, I removed. So if it was equipment or special professional services for some kind of study or something like that was in 23, I removed those going forward so that they wouldn't continue. And then, excuse me, I added the SAFER grant. So we received the SAFER grant, which was for the firefighter recruitment and retention coordinator position. We did receive word after the budget was adopted that we were awarded that grant again for another 4 years, starting in this year, 23. So put that it's up max of 75,000 a year. So I added that 75,000 for 23 through 26 to represent that portion of that position being funded by the grant. And then for the 24 to 29, 6 years, there's certain revenue growth assumptions. So looking, those assumptions are based on historical trends for revenue, current economic environment, current development environment, and such. And so, would you like us to wait?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Property tax set at 2%. So that assumes the council takes the 1% that is optional for you to do, and 1% on new construction. New construction varies. We've kind of been in a high development growth period, so it could tend to be a little bit more, but we try and be conservative and leave it at just about 1%. Sales tax, looking historically over the next 6 years, kind of averages out to about 4 to 4.5%. Utility taxes, we have internal and external. They vary greatly. Cable, telephone, those kind of are pretty flat, but we have other ones are own internal based on when we do rates we tend to go about 4, maybe 5% increase on those. So there's an average of 4% across all the utility taxes. State shared revenue is about 6% looking historically. So that's mostly the liquor tax and profits and then the marijuana. They did change some legislation on the marijuana too. So we're starting to get a little bit more. They're allocating more to the cities. So that's good. And then planning and building revenue, kind of an average of about 3% per year. No, it worked the first time and then it's not working now. Can you just hit next slide? Space bar down arrow.
No.
No, it should be on hers. Expenditure growth assumptions, salaries, an average of about 4% a year, benefits. Some don't change, some do. So there's an average of about 8% a year. Supplies, 3% average. Professional services covers a wide range of things. It covers anything from our dispatch and jail contracts to our city attorney services to engineering. So it's kind of a wide range. And so that's an average also of about 4%. And then our insurance about 12%. We've had a little bit lower, but we also have had higher. So we pegged it at about 12% average for that. So with those assumptions and starting from the 23, provides this general fund forecast. So the colors are a little the same on there, even though on paper they're quite different. Sorry. So the top line.
And this is the same chart that is in your packet.
In your
to make
packet,
it
yeah.
Easier to read.
Yes. So you'll notice that the top line is the expenditures and they are greater than the revenue. The revenue is the bottom line. So there is the deficit, which is represented by the numbers below. 2023, it shows that I left showing that deficit so that we could see how that changes. There is the note at the bottom talking about the different things that were funded to use to balance the budget. So that 736,000 was balanced with the one-time items we've talked about. So looking at 24 and beyond, that baseline forecast generates a deficit of 693,000 starting in 24. And that's again, keeping our same level of service, same level of staffing, and just using the revenue and the growth assumptions. So expenditures outpace revenue. Yes.
Hey, sorry, I don't want to derail the presentation, but kind of want to get a baseline for the baseline. So,
Sure.
I've only been around for a couple budgets, and this is the first we've ever actually talked about any kind of deficit. So this is kind of new.
Right. 23, we did talk about it last year during
A
the
little
23
bit,
budget.
yeah. This is the first time we've dug into anything like this.
First time we've had a
For
forecast
sure.
forward.
So when did all this start? Because certainly it wasn't like 2023 all of a sudden it's widespread.
No.
How did this come about?
Do you want to take?
I want to provide some reassurance that I think almost every city faces this issue every year. Oftentimes you see cities put together some sort of forecast so that they're able to plan for the future. Oftentimes there's budgets that are planned on a biennial basis, which requires a forecast, but this isn't unique in terms of having some sort of a deficit, for the fact of the matter that our revenue grows a lot slower than our expenditures. Salaries and benefits is a big part of that. But from what Sandy and I have done over the last couple of weeks is look at prior budgets, and I would potentially date it back as far as 2006. We had a B&O tax prior to that was repealed. At the time, it was bringing in about $50,000 in revenue. It was based off of gross sales for just a couple of businesses. And that was repealed. That revenue was never replaced. And then on top of that, since 2006, we've had periods of a lot of growth in population. And then we've brought on new staff. And when staff has left, we've reevaluated and changed department structures. And so I think it's just been a compounding issue over time. If that B&O tax, though, for example, was still in place, we would have that additional revenue likely. And so if you look for since 2006 to now, all of the years and the gross sales for businesses in Buckley then compared to now, It probably would be significantly more than 50,000 using DOR data. We are estimating it being closer to about 500,000 is what we would see today at a 2% tax. So I think it's the compound of a lot of different things. Part of it is that we've seen spikes in growth with population, and we have not necessarily seen spikes in services at the same rate. And so at different times, we've seen a higher increase in services, which was based off of wages and salaries at that time versus maybe when the original population spike happened. So several different factors that have led us to have this amount of a deficit, but it isn't a unique situation for Buckley. And it is something that we will continue to have to revisit every year, every biennium.
And it's not unique to us as a city either.
No.
Most cities have a deficit. The gap, you'll hear, lots of other councils refer to how they're dealing with the gap. The gap is the fact that revenues can't keep pace with expenses when most cities, one of the largest revenue sources is property tax, and your property tax can only grow at that 1% plus the new construction. And so it just can't, that source can't keep pace with when you're looking at 4, 5, 6% growth on personnel, and personnel being 75% of your general fund. So we had the deficit for 23 that we had talked about. I would venture to say if we went back and really broke down 22, there was probably a deficit in 22. Again, funded by one time. Prior to 21, I can't say how it was balanced. But it's not unique for this year. It's not unique to our city. So, and it is a combination of all of those different things. Lots of cities do grow incrementally, and Buckley just hasn't been that way. It's been this spike and flattening, but we haven't necessarily jumped equally revenue and expenses together, and we haven't necessarily even incrementally increased revenue to try and keep up with the spikes. And so I think all those combinations that she talked about has really come to light now when we're trying to look really in depth more and going forward to say, what are those combination of those things? Loss of revenue, large increases in personnel, increased services to keep pace with the growing city. When you combine all those things, what does that come out to be? And it comes out to be a larger whole than we would hope. Is that?
I got a question regarding the 2006 repeal of the B&O tax. Was that by initiative or by the council
It was
action?
by the
Council action.
And I had a comment about that. If I recall, not all of it, but one aspect to eliminating that was in the hope of attracting commercial business, businesses. And at the time we were trying to, not we, I wasn't on it then, but I remember it. And we were trying to think of ways to make establishing your business in Buckley more attractive. And then we thought that would be a way to eliminate the cost prohibitive part of the B&O tax.
In the ordinance repealing it, it is mentioned that at the time with a lot of like Bonnie Lake and other cities surrounding, getting a lot of the big box and bigger retail, that having a negative effect on the smaller businesses, that the council at the time felt that by repealing that might help them, get a little better advantage at the time.
Is that something that could be reenacted by council action
Correct.
rather than voters?
Correct.
Up to 2%.
And I
Point
believe-
0.2%.
Yeah, and I believe that we were at 0.1 before, based off of the calculations.
Yeah.
So we could go up to 0.2.
And I was just gonna add too that I know it probably some of it flew under the radar, but you'll have to forgive me, I don't remember which group was under. We were negotiating for salaries and benefits at the end of 22, and there was a decision that I had to make where we were going to land on percentages for that. And that was one of the things I tried to rein it down as much as possible to keep that deficit as it was still there, but keep it, we didn't highlight
Make
the
it-
fact
make
that
it
we
more.
were in that deficit, but all those little pieces trying to make a dent in it where we could.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so given that we know there's a $693,000 deficit based on that baseline forecast, Courtney and I worked with some of the departments to look at what options could we look at and suggest and recommend off the top. So the scenario one forecast assumptions, again, built on 23 with the one times removed. Safer grant is added and all the same revenue and growth assumptions that were in the baseline for 24 in the future years all remain the same. The differences and additions are, we looked at our passport program and I had a revelation and calculated some numbers and was very surprised. We are inundated with passports. We went from 2 days a week to 3 days a week and we're still booking 4 to 5 weeks out and turning people away. So it's amazingly busy. So I looked at what would it take or what would it generate if we hired anywhere from a 0.4 to a 0.5 FTE just to focus solely on passports about 8 hours a day. So 2 days a week, full passports all day. And for 24, the net new revenue after expenses of the position are $90,000. So, and that was on a conservative estimate of, so many appointments an hour, so many passports per appointment. We're allowed to charge $35 per passport. That's set by the feds. We can't change that part. But it did generate some significant amount of revenue. And so we included that starting in 23, half a year. So if we started it actually in half of this year, it generated about $50,000 and then it's almost a little over 90,000 for next year. So that's included. We know our planning permit revenue, there's areas that could be increased, whether that's intake fees, more cost recovery, looking at staffing hours on development. And so as a very conservative, just included $50,000 of planning and permit revenue, related revenue starting in 24. Looked at adding some recreation programming at a conservative amount of 20,000 starting in 24. So that would either mean maybe more Buckley Hall rentals, more pay for play type activities and programming of activities. And so 20,000 starting in 24 for that. Looking at business license revenue, we're at $75 flat per business license right now. The 7,500 that we included in here was just going up a nominal $10. We have about 750 licensees in the city. So that was an additional $10. We can look at business licenses since it's a general fund revenue and council sets it. It can be on a whole host of things. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. It doesn't have to be a flat fee. It can be on several other factors, but we can, when we get to that. And then also for the scenario one forecast, we looked at in talking about something that we'll talk about a little later this evening on our EMS program was looking at our fire department personnel and how they're allocated. So right now, 75% of the paid staff is in the general fund and 25% is in our EMS fund. Our EMS fund is funded based just the EMS levy. So that split being 75% fire services in the general fund and 25% EMS medical related services in the EMS fund. Knowing that that's probably not an accurate split, the fire department personnel spend much more time on EMS and medical than they do on fire. We felt it was even probably able to be flipped the other way, but the EMS fund doesn't, the EMS fund can't support 75% of the costs because again, the EMS levy is just like the property tax levy. It can only grow at 1%. So we looked at making some small shift to recognize that where those services are spent and what savings could that bring to the general fund and moved it from a 75-25 split to a 60-40. And then that generated additional savings in the general fund of a reduction of expenditures, about $70,000 in 24 that then increments going forward into the other years. So with those assumptions built in, based on top of the baseline, we dropped the 2024 deficit from 693,000 down to 455. So still significant deficit to address, but some small changes and efficiencies by reallocating staff and creating a self-sustaining passport program and those things dropped us down to 455,000. Any questions on that? Yes.
Yeah, could this gap be closed in by like, I don't know, just a beefier commercial sector? And how much like would we have to see our commercial sector grow to close that gap?
It's hard to estimate because you have several sources that come in from the commercial sector, depending on what kind of services or businesses you bring in. They may be retail, so you generate sales tax. But if they're not retail, you're not generating sales tax. So there's that. There's, one-time type permitting costs of businesses coming in. But because we don't have a B&O, we're not generating anything from a gross receipt standpoint. So it's really just either sales tax or somewhat one-time permit type stuff and the business license itself, which is obviously a small piece.
We have estimates though, that for example, the McDonald's that's been proposed, that's likely to bring in about $100,000 per year annually. And we'll see once it's developed what it actually brings in, but that's the initial estimate. So yes, some cities do really emphasize economic development in order to find ways to close their gap. And I would say that it's those that have a really robust economic development program and that are continuing to grow in that way that are maybe those few cities that don't have a problem with a deficit. But even then, oftentimes you find that your expenses outweigh your revenue.
Yeah. One other question.
Sure.
Regarding the passports. So is that, you said it's like 5 weeks out right now. Has it always been that way? Or is that kind of like the post-COVID, let's go to like Panama or whatever? And do you think that's gonna be sustained?
Right. And that was one question I really looked at. It has been more than just these past couple of months. I'd say it's been going on about a year. It's been,
keep
I mean, it's been
thinking gonna
incrementing.
Slow down, but
Yeah, it's been
not slowing down.
incrementing this way a good year. Definitely since post-COVID. Obviously, we weren't doing them at all
Sure.
when we were closed down and those kind of things. And so I think people, yes, are tired of being shut in. And so everyone's like, let's go travel. And we need a passport. So I think it's a combination of that. I think it's a combination of just there's more people around than since we didn't do them for a couple of years, we didn't have that data. I do think it is sustainable, only because looking at there's other cities that have had half the full-time positions doing passports for years and are still continuing to do that. So we get calls and people coming from quite far away. I had the call that I just took today and he wanted a passport appointment and I told him when we were and he was like, oh, I'm traveling soon. Well, you're the first on my list, so I'll keep calling kind of thing. Like people are calling us because they hear that we have a lot of appointments and that we can, do them. And so I think it's sustainable at some point. Is there a saturation or kind of a leveling off? A little bit, yes. And so, but it's generating sufficient revenue that, even a little bit of a dip in that is still going to be a win to the general fund for sure. But yeah, it's amazing how many people.
We've had people come from Olympia, Ravensdale, like all over.
Yeah.
like,
So it's not
everyone's
It's not,
this.
no,
There's
yeah,
actually
Wondering
fewer
about-
passport offices now than there was.
There was.
So
Didn't
they're-
Bonnie
they've
Lake stop?
become more
Yeah, Bonnie
consolidated.
Lake.
yeah, Bonnie Lake stopped doing theirs.
Drivers.
Enumclaw is booked out further than we are.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah,
And
so
we-
everybody is telling them to come to us and it's becoming.
Yeah.
crazy.
and for those cities that don't have dedicated staff like with us, it's a big interruption to Jessica, Michelle, and Kristen and Treva are all passport certified. I'd say Jessica and Michelle do 90% or more of them. And then Treva and Kristen fill in where needed. They're the two main people. But I mean, it's very interrupting. We book them right now about maybe once every half an hour. And if you have one or two passports and they have all their paperwork, you can get them done in 10 minutes, right? But then that's about 20 minutes then, and then the next one shows up and they might be 3 or 4. So it takes a whole, and so it's very interrupting to the staff too, to be stopping their work constantly to do that. Where if you had someone dedicated that was taking the phone calls to make the appointments and doing them, there's an efficiency that we gain on our current staff too, by not spending those 2 or 3 days a week, losing half of their, well, not half, but I mean, losing big chunks of their day of their work time doing the passports. So I think there's a win-win all around. And we can just bring that many more people in. So, yeah. Mhm.
Questions regarding that?
I was just gonna touch back on the B&O tax real quick. The projection or the estimate of 500,000 was at 0.2.
Point 2.
So, and that's something council could choose to go to a 0.1 or
Something, yeah.
what have you, and that would close up the gap real fast, but that's just one of the tools in the toolbox.
Right.
Well, I could support reinstating a B&O tax to a certain level with the caveat that we could waive new businesses for a period of time. So they want to reinvest, they want to invest in Buckley. They get a waiver until they're up and running, whatever that looks like. I don't even know if that's legal. We'd have to have the city attorney talk about that,
Right.
but here we are talking about a deficit going forward, and everybody here knows that the only thing not the only thing, but the top priority is public safety. And we have to provide public safety. The people of this town like what they have. They will not accept anything less than that. And if that is causing, at least the police department is, they negotiate their wages every 3 years or whatever. And if you want to have a fully staffed police department, you have to take the steps that we have taken in the past to keep that. With that said, a lot of these scenarios that we're going through here, I'm wondering, okay, yes, we have to address that, but just because we have budgeted a certain amount of money for stuff like the trail parking lot, do we need to spend that money when we're facing a deficit?
Different funds.
Different funds. So the things that like the trail parking lot is capital funds that we can't use for the general fund.
City Hall remodel,
Same thing.
know what's needed.
Capital funds that are not allowed to use for operations.
Are we gonna take on the maintenance and operation of a pickleball facility?
It's not included in the toolbox of options for this evening.
Yes.
I'm just
Didn't
saying,
even
why
put
would
it on
we
there.
be exploring this stuff when we are facing a budget deficit? The pickleball thing, is that general fund?
It could, a lot of the options that we've identified is a way to subsidize the general fund, even if it goes into a separate fund by freeing up dollars from the general fund. So I think that the pickleball facility could potentially, not to get us off track with that, but could potentially free up dollars that are currently used for parks and recreation from the general fund.
So there's no accounting tool that can be used based on the budget that we pass every year to account for a deficit.
The use of one,
I'm not sure. What do you, when you say accounting tool?
I think that
An
we
accounting tool.
I think that we have oftentimes found one-time funds in order to balance the general fund and looked at just
1 year.
balancing the general fund 1 year at a time without necessarily looking ahead. It's a different way of budgeting. This is a different way of budgeting. And so we've done surplusing of properties. There's been several in the last 5 years. And PSE easements is another example. And going further back, and we're happy to do that if council is interested in seeing what's been done in the past. But ultimately, from what we can tell, a forecast has never been done. And it really has been looking at the budget 1 year at a time and finding one-time sources of revenue in order to make sure that the funds were balanced.
Councilor Burbank.
Sorry, I was under the impression that in previous, like when Dave was here, if they were facing like budget deficit, they'd go to department head and say, you need to cut this amount, figure out where you're gonna cut this amount and go to the department heads as well.
Yep, and
We
we did that
You
this
did,
last year
okay,
too. I
Okay,
think it was 110 or 130 that we were able
Yeah,
to cut
100.
this last year. And that is definitely one of the things in the toolbox.
Okay.
Is we need to continue to evaluate
Yeah.
expenditures, and that's something we have to do every year.
okay.
And for forever, we're never gonna be at a
Stop.
point where we just stop looking at departmental spending. But that is definitely one thing that,
Yeah, it was almost 130 to get to the 800,000 deficit that we did start with for 23. It was after the departments had cut about 130,000.
And it's generally based on like in layman's terms, the pie chart. You know,
Mhm.
police, you're getting X percentage of the pie chart. If you've got 40% of the budget, then your portion is bigger than planning or whatever.
Right.
Percentage
That are asked to cut.
distribution, Yeah,
You know,
yeah, we use that to help lower the deficit. Okay. So we can talk about the toolbox.
No.
Nope, there we go. Okay, so first option would be those that council has the authority to impose. And we talked about the B&O tax. It is a tax on businesses' gross receipts. Most businesses pay a B&O tax to the state, to the Department of Revenue. And if they have a business in other cities, they may pay a B&O tax to those cities too. So all businesses pay one to the state already, and then just cities are allowed to impose their own B&O tax on top of that. The rate can be up to 0.2%. And then you can have varying rates by business class. So you could have one rate for retail, one rate for wholesale, one rate for, manufacturing. You can't vary the rates within the class. So you couldn't say, clothing retail has a certain rate versus, grocery store retail. You can't do that, but you can vary the rates by type of class. They're unrestricted, so they can be used for any lawful government purpose. Again, we talked about that we had one and repealed it. And then, yes, the current estimate would be anywhere from 250 to 500,000. And that was looking at a 0.1% up to a 0.2% for that. Business license fees, we are currently at $75 per year. There's no cap on what you can charge. It's up to the council for that. And cities do it very differently. So you can have a flat amount. You could do it based on the number of FTEs a business has. So larger businesses with more FTEs would pay more than a small business. You could do it some do it on a square footage. So large space pays more. And you can do it even on gross receipts or a combination thereof. Several cities that I know, some that I've worked at, do it on a combination. They have a portion of maybe FTEs and gross receipts, or a flat. Everybody pays one flat, and then the bigger you are, you pay some incremental so that the small ones get a small charge, and then the larger businesses pay more. Yes.
Do we know what cities around us charge for their, like Enumclaw or Bonnie Lake, or what?
We're right in
Or how is
line.
this determined?
Most of the ones around us are flat amounts as well, and they're about the same.
Yeah, got it.
Yep.
Comments regarding B&O and business license? Nope. Go ahead.
Okay. The business license also is unrestricted, so it can be used for any government purpose, which is why it's in the general fund. Development related revenue. So we talked a little bit about that, increasing permit fees, like intake, increasing just the planning fees for different types of planning developments, cost recovery of staff time. We do some of that. We feel that there's a study needed to address that a little bit more. We've had a lot of changeover in planning as well over the years. And so I think some of the tracking of that's been lost, not because of the current staff, but just because of that changeover, both in planning and in finance, that's been a little bit, lost because of the no one really following what was done before. So we think a study is needed to really address what should be getting charged on the planning and building related permits.
And that can be done in-house by tracking the actual amount of time that's spent on different permit types, and then assessing that based off of the fully burdened hourly rate for our different staff members.
Some of these appear small changes, but imagine
could add up.
put together, the
Put
impact
together.
would be pretty effective.
Yeah.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Dimes and dollars.
Yeah, right.
Dollars,
Yeah, right. The Parks and Recreation revenue, we had included to that 20,000 in the scenario one. So different options that could be, it could be increasing the rentals at Buckley Hall. Right now, it rents, but there is definitely more capacity for it to be rented.
We could market it more heavily. We don't currently really market it.
What's the current rental rate?
Off the top of my head, I'm not certain.
$1,000 on Friday,
For a
Saturday
full-
and Sundays for a
full
full
day.
day. And then there's a refundable deposit of $350 or $750.
Depending on if you have.
And oftentimes for weddings, we see 2 days rented back to back, like Friday, Saturday, or Saturday, Sunday for setup and takedown.
Yeah, and we could do an analysis of what other rental facilities for types of weddings and those kind of venues in the area would be. But we have heard from some that call and say, oh, wow, that's a really good price.
Yes.
Especially
Yeah.
I can tell you
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that pales in comparison to like
Yeah.
Kelly Farms.
Yeah.
Kelly.
And
Yeah,
we
3
could-
times that.
And we could set the
We can
rate to
see,
keep
but we-
it
yeah.
lower for Buckley
Well, and
residents.
after the remodel.
Right, we can have a resident rate and non-resident rates.
Yeah.
Is there still a consideration for funerals? We have always had a special.
We don't have anything in our fee schedule right now, I don't believe.
I don't think so.
But
There
There is a memorial.
The new The new
Um,
rate schedule that they just adopted.
Yeah.
For Buckley Hall has a
Remember.
consideration for
Good.
funerals,
Good.
yeah.
I thought that, I like that.
I don't know the amount.
I know, yeah, but it's less.
Yeah, there, yep, we
Definitely.
Availability is important.
Yeah.
And we started some of this work this last year when we
Mhm,
looked at
mhm.
the rates comparison and who and when we were renting it out and at what rate for different organizations. So, yeah.
So it's lawful for us to charge a city resident
Yes.
one fee and a non-city resident another fee.
It is.
Yes.
Many cities use that for rentals and even for activities, recreation programs and stuff. They'll have a resident rate and a non-resident
And
rate.
I don't recall if there's still a differentiation between the nonprofit organizations than the profit.
There is for 501c3s, and then there's even further a step that you can have if they come with an MOU to the city council. We're going to see an example of that for the museum, I believe, at our next council meeting.
Good.
So there is a ability to market
Yes,
Buckley Hall.
Yep.
It's a great space.
Yep.
And I was not aware that it wasn't being marketed now.
it's just not as much as it could.
Could be.
We
We could do more. We could do more.
Mhm,
Yes.
mhm.
The,
We could do.
the other area is we really don't have a lot of like paid for play. They're called activities where whether it's youth or adult, and that could be classes of any types of kind, arts, exercise, recreation type classes. We don't do leagues right now. We don't necessarily have the fields and stuff to do leagues, but any of those type of things that could be done at our youth center or in this building at Buckley Hall, where we could put on and organize classes and charge.
Is adult education like we used to have, is that what you're speaking about? Like
Those,
classes
it could be
or-
anything. It could be yoga classes, it could be arts classes, it could be music classes, dance
Photography.
classes, photography, yeah.
So if through.
Basket
if
weaving,
through
yeah, sure.
Parks and Recs program, we wanted to host events, individuals could sign up to play. We don't have facilities right now, like baseball fields or something that the city owns and operates that we would be able to host leagues out of. Other
Right.
cities have that. This is the revenue generating for Parks and Rec.
Yeah.
And this will come back in more discussion with pickleball as well as other ideas as we go through the pros plan. It's just one tool in the toolbox right now that we estimate would probably, given our existing facility and capacity, be about 20,000. Our director Snodgrass, unfortunately, isn't here tonight. She wasn't here this last week when we were coming up with this. So I think that this is a pretty conservative number. And we might be able to see more growth next year.
Yeah.
Even beyond 20, but
Yeah.
If we did that, if we did do that, would that increase the amount, like, we wouldn't need to increase FTE for Parks and Rec to do that? Or would we have to increase FTE for Parks and Rec to be able to do additional classes? I'm just thinking because it takes time, right?
yeah, it depends
Right.
on the host. So right
Mhm.
now we have a system worked out with some different organizations and the way that we like rent out Buckley Hall or the different facilities, they're able to pick up a key and then drop it off in the Dropbox. And so I think it depends on the facility. And if we were looking to, for example, rent out this facility, which we don't currently because of all of the equipment that's always up, that would require additional FTE if council decided, and we'd have to make sure that that penciled out where the amount that we were renting this facility for justified the cost of having an FTE that was here monitoring to make sure that all of the equipment stayed where it needed to be. So we would have to set those rates to make sure that they were at least recovering the cost of that, but ideally,
Making money,
yes,
right,
increasing
okay.
Yeah.
beyond.
And that speaks to the last bullet, just making sure that we acknowledge the fact that you do have to account for
Yeah.
any of the associated costs to organize, monitor and maintain those.
Yeah.
You would have to get like probably a registration software system, one-time cost, but something that you would be able to use for registration and that type of stuff. So, but it is an area that, you're,
And I will say that our directors have come up with lists even beyond this that we're
Even-
still currently vetting,
Right.
even as early as
Yes,
this
yeah.
morning and yesterday. And so we are continuing to try to think of innovative ways to increase revenue. Some of it is small amounts, but for example, passport photos.
we could add those on. We
we
don't do
could-
those now, but we could.
But some agencies
That would
do.
be a great
And right now
idea.
going to Walgreens or Rite Aid, you're paying $12 to $14 and we could have the one-time
Mhm.
investment of, yes, we can take your photo here too. And have
especially
that
for-
added to the fee schedule with the number of, so things like that, we're still trying to work through and we'll come to you with more, but this was the initial list that we.
That we came with, yeah.
Are there other options to like increase the contracts like we have with Wilkeson and Carbonado
Yes,
for public safety
Mm-hmm.
services?
yes.
And I believe the contract with DSHS is up. This come for 24, correct? For 24. So that contract has been set for the last couple, huh?
This year.
Okay, so this year for police and 24 for fire. So that contract's been flat for the last several years for fire and police with DSHS for Rainier, and that is up for negotiation for both of those starting. So we haven't seen an increase, but yet obviously police and fire costs have been going up.
As
So,
well as with Crystal Mountain.
yeah. Which we'll
Not that
address.
law
So,
enforcement's doing any traffic stops or anything in this era we live in where you can't do your job, but couldn't we also increase fines and penalties?
There's certain regulations regarding the maximums for those. What we can do is include in our code with something that we don't have that the chief brought to my attention this morning. It would basically make sure that more of those, the revenue dollars stay with us for criminal justice versus going to the state that they do now. So there is a change that we could make to make sure that we're receiving more of those dollars. That would be under the council's purview by changing our code.
there you go.
Perfect.
See,
Anybody else?
I just feel hopeful about this. I think it's an excellent thing that we're looking at rather than year to year. I feel more comfortable with it. And I think it's a wise thing to do over needed.
thank you. Okay. Really? Okay. So some voter approved options, public safety sales tax. So we currently get a criminal justice sales tax that goes into a fund that helps fund police equipment. That one is just shared with us from a county tax and based on population and other demographics. But a public safety sales tax, the council could put out as a vote. It just requires a simple majority voter approval. It is required a third to be used for criminal justice and or fire protection services. And motor vehicle sales and the first 36 months of motor vehicle leases are exempt, which for Buckley, we don't have a lot of car dealerships, so it's not going to impact us as much. Cities that have a lot of car dealerships, then that obviously makes a big difference. But that is one exemption for it. Our current estimate would be at a 0.1%, which is what you're allowed to do. That's the max. It's about 150,000. So, but that would, you would have to go out to the votes for that one. And then a property tax levy lid lift. We haven't just brought this up with council both during last year, during the 23 development. We talked about it and it's been mentioned a couple of times this year. So wanted to just provide some information on that. It is a simple majority voter approval because it's just property tax general revenue. It's used for any lawful government purpose. There's various types. There's frequency of it. So is it a single year lift versus a multi-year, or permanency? You can do it temporary or permanent. At our current assessed valuation, about every 10-cent increase in our rate would generate about 110,000 of revenue. And then I have a chart to show you kind of the matrix of that. So the difference between the single year and the multi-year is really to think about right now, you can raise property taxes the 1%. So the single year would be the way to think of the single year versus multi-year is how many more years do you want to be able to raise it above 1%? Do you want to just be able to raise it above 1% for 1 year? So you say, hey, we're gonna raise it up to 3% this year. So that's a single year lift that raises your base, and then you have that new base going forward, and you can only increase 1% after that. So it's a one-time single year, 1 year lift. A multi-year lift is we're gonna set the new base 3% up. And then each year for the next up to 6 years, we're going to increase it 2%. And so you can do multi-year, you keep raising that base up. And that can be up to 6 years. Along with that, single year or multi-year, you either have permanent or temporary. So if it's a temporary lift, you raise it, and then whatever time period you've set it for, maybe you want that lift to last 2 years or 3 years after that time period, it actually goes, your revenue would go back down. That levy lid lift of raising the base goes away, and they put you back at your highest lawful of what you had been had the lift never happened. So a lot of cities don't do that because unless they're trying to get specific revenue for a specific purpose, they don't usually do a levy lid lift and go out to the voters just to raise it for a certain amount of time and then take it away. The permanent option then is once you raise it, it stays in place, obviously forever. It's a permanent lift. And so there's this little matrix that just kind of aligns out those options. And then on your multi-year, if you lifted it multi-years up to 6 years, once those 6 years run out, then it again goes back to just 1% optional that you have. It can be used for any lawful. On the multi-year, you do have to use it for whatever you state in the ballot measure. So the multi-year makes it a little bit more specific. You have to say in the ballot measure what you're going to use it for. A single year lift, you could just say general, general government services or something, but the multi-year has to be a little more specific. There's no supplanting restrictions, which means you could use it to pay for services that you already have. You don't have to add new just because you're raising additional revenue. You can use it to use current services. And then it lists out when you can do it from an election date standpoint, single year at basically any election, and then a multi-year only at primary or general. And again, only a simple majority. So we just wanted to provide that information to council. I know it's been brought up. Courtney and I talking, we felt like it wasn't necessarily the one we wanted to recommend into the scenario forecast right now, since we wanted to look at some of these other more internal council driven options. Obviously still do our expenditure review. We felt that there was other options to add into the scenario one forecast and talk about first before we moved to the voter lid lift. And maybe that, when we keep doing these forecasts and keep moving out, once we've exhausted our own internal revenue options and expenditure review, and we still have a deficit, then that's when maybe we go talk about a levy lid lift. So, but I wanted to provide that information just about what your options are. Any questions on that? Okay.
Sina?
So one-time resources, we have been using these for the last probably couple of years to balance the budget, which is general fund balance. It's basically unspent cash from year to year. That balance is kind of composed of multiple things. You do have a kind of a component of a reserve in there. You have working capital. So our expenses kind of tend to go out roughly equal a month because 75% of the general fund is staff and you pay the staff monthly. But our revenue, with it being one huge piece on the general fund being property tax, and property tax comes in mostly in April, May, and then mostly again in October, November, there's that spike in the revenue. So you need working capital to cover those fluctuations in cash flow. And then it varies because based on planned uses, sometimes like this year, we plan to use some of our ending fund balance. So it might be, lower next year than this year. So it's not a steady stream of constantly increasing or decreasing. It will vary up and down. Another reserve, the cumulative reserve fund, is an accumulation of unexpended general fund resources. So when revenues come in greater than expenses at the year end, and we have maybe additional cash and fund balance on the general fund, it can be put over into this cumulative reserve fund. And in the next bullet's just straight from our code as far as the creation of it, just used to mitigate impacts of future unanticipated general fund revenue shortfalls, budgetary imbalances, and shortages in working capital, and provide revenue in emergency times. The approval to use it does require 2/3 approval of the council. So it's not a simple majority vote to use the cumulative reserve fund. It's super majority, 2/3. And currently the balance in that fund is about $5 million.
Is there anything in the Buckley Municipal Code that specifies the funding level of the reserve account?
So for the cumulative reserve fund, no, it can be, there's no cap, there's no funding level. I didn't list do you have another reserve, but it's not necessarily for this type of, it's not for budgetary imbalances. We have a contingency fund, which is about 320,000 right now. It is set by statute at 0.375 per thousand of AV. So there's a calculation, you have a cap on it, which we're getting kind of close to that cap as far as what can be in there. But it is truly in the code, it is listed for emergency and unforeseen expenses type of thing. So it's not necessarily as it's a simple majority to use it, but it's listed in code for emergencies and unexpected events, versus the cumulative reserve fund is more listed. You can use it for the budgetary imbalances and shortfalls of revenue.
But
And-
wouldn't this be considered, could that be considered an emergency though? And use some of the contingency fund because we're in a deficit?
I don't think so.
Not as cleanly,
Yeah.
no. And it's a little bit more limited. We only have the 320,000 in there right now.
Because this
So-
year we aren't in a deficit. If we were at the point,
Okay.
right, so if we were at the
Next
point
year,
where we
sorry.
couldn't balance,
Okay.
then and there was an emergency, then I think
I
that we
think
could. use it.
Yeah.
But because we have funds and resources to be able to balance, you can't pull from that contingency.
Got it. Okay.
And I just quickly, the general fund right now, the balance that you have, I don't know, I know you have your budget book, page 13 of the budget book includes ARPA. So our fund balance right now in the general fund includes all of our ARPA dollars. So when we talk about how we pulled from the general fund balance, that included the allocations that we made for ARPA and that we're continuing to make, for example, for the small business grants, for the nonprofit grants, as well as for our own one-time expenses.
Which is why, if looking at that, the beginning fund balance for 23 was 1.9 million and our ending fund balance is only 1.1 million. And because there's that specific use of those resources, the PSE money came in 22. So it is part of our 1.9 beginning balance. And then we use that 350 of that balance to balance. So it goes away, as well as using some of the ARPA and that kind of thing. So that's why there's the intention drawdown from beginning to end in 23's fund balance. Thank you for pointing that. Any other questions on the reserves or one time?
I have one more question.
Sure.
For Fund 307, the capital improvements, would it be possible to see a breakdown of that to double check that it's not all REIT money? Because if there's other money in there that's not REIT money, that could be used, correct?
Yes, it should be all capital money that's in there.
Okay.
We can definitely double check.
Okay.
Other revenue sources, I'll introduce this and then I'll probably have Chief Scogan come up and address it. So along with looking at our emergency and fire and protection emergency medical services, and I spoke earlier about the distribution of the staffing costs when 75-25 out of balance compared to what service levels, they spend much more time on medical calls and EMS type services than they do on fire. Also, there's the idea of revenue from what we bill for transport. So right now we currently bill for all BLS, which is basic life service transports. And we have an AMR unit stationed at the fire station. They usually will bill and transport for ALS, advanced life support. We only bill for ALS when AMR is unavailable. So if AMR is unavailable, we get the ALS call and we transport that, then we can bill for that. But right now we're only billing for BLS. So staff has talked about the idea of what if we stood up our own ALS unit in-house and not contract with AMR. The quick math is that it would be self-sustaining from the amount that we could do for transport billings. And so that quick analysis says we should do some more analysis. So I'll let Chief Scogan address that more.
Sure. So the agreement that we have with AMR now was put in place in 2007, and it was done at a time when that was the only option to serve the entire area with paramedics and an ambulance service. Right now, we're paying AMR $85,000 a year as a subsidy for that service. They have an ambulance in our fire station with a paramedic, and a Buckley Fire volunteer or staff member is the partner, is the driver. 30% of our calls overlap, meaning we have 2 or more calls going on at once. So today, if the first person that calls 911, and if it's advanced life support, they're going to get the co-staffed AMR unit. AMR is a for-profit company that bills. If somebody calls 911 even 30 seconds later, which happens quite frequently in the city, they will get a basic life support fire department ambulance where we currently bill. But the benefit is if we were to stand up our own full-time transport program, there would be no disparity in the ambulance billing. Fire department currently only bills insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, no out-of-pocket expense. So based on the information that we've gathered, we believe that the revenue would sustain our own full-time paramedic program, transporting all of our patients.
Do you want to talk about the SAFER grant you've applied for?
Yeah. So in addition to the SAFER grant, the fire department just received which is our second one. To fund our volunteer recruitment and retention coordinator, we've also submitted a SAFER grant for the current year that we're in to hire 4 firefighter paramedics. And that's 100% zero match from the city for 4 years.
And we will find out.
We
later.
could find out as soon as June of this year or as late as June of 2024.
I heard a rumor that AMR is going to pull out of Pierce County in June. Is that correct?
So AMR has already pulled out of Pierce County.
Yeah.
There are physically only 2 units in the county, one at the American Lake VA to transport patients in and out of there. And the only other one is in our fire station.
But they're under contract.
Yeah,
So they-
our contract is through the end of this year. There are several benefits for the community of seeing a much lower ambulance bill, local control, and zero out-of-pocket expense.
And the AMR unit will bill after insurance and Medicaid, so they will send the balance to whoever the individual was.
To the
that did
individual to
transport
self-pay,
services.
where the fire department does not do that.
So what I heard you say, Chief, is that we pay AMR $85K a year for their services. And to have a paramedic program, it seems to me that it would be more expensive than $85,000 a year with pay and benefits.
Mhm.
But what could happen is the billing could be adjusted to have it self-sufficient.
Correct.
So a unit would go out with a full-time and your reserve program as it is, that would be, and you have reserve paramedics. So that could be self-sustaining by the different billing options. They just go to insurance, Medicaid, Medicare, Aetna, whatever, without having to pay 85 grand to AMR, which the contract's up to the end of the year and they're pulling out of Pierce County.
Basically, you're correct.
Summary.
So the AMR unit did 586 transports last year. One of our fire department ambulances did 53 transports last year. The 53 transports that the fire department did alone brought in just shy of $30,000.
So that's 300,000 if you just extrapolate at the base, at the rate we're paying now.
Mhm.
And not what we could increase.
Correct.
Questions, comments on that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We will be exploring that more. The other side of the toolbox, the expenditures, as we talked about, we did look at, departments did cut for 2023 to help balance. And so we will continue that in several ways, looking at personnel distributions. Kind of as we saw with the fire and EMS, there was a little bit of out of balance there as far as where they're actually spending their time on which services and what's funding it. So we would look at all staff just to make sure that their distributions are correct and what they are in the general fund is what they are doing service level wise compared to maybe if it's related to utilities or one of the other funds outside of the general fund. Develop an indirect cost allocation plan, an ICAP. This is a budgeted 23 expense to develop this. So an indirect cost allocation plan takes the administrative type services that are in the general fund. So administration, finance, HR, IT, city attorney, all of those, and distributes them out to other funds that use those services. So one area specifically would be utilities. Utilities, our enterprise funds have to be self-sustaining, self-sufficient, and pay for all of their services. So all of us support the utilities, and so utilities has to pay their share. There's been an internal in-house model used for several years here. And so we would just want to go outside and get a little bit more up-to-date type of plan that's a little easier to maintain. The current in-house model requires staff to track time constantly to do that. And I've used and worked with these plans in many other cities, and there's other ways you can allocate the cost without having to do that staff and time tracking. There's other bases of allocation. And so I think it's beneficial that we would do this to get a really good external view as well from the professionals that to create those, to make sure that we're allocating those costs accurately and appropriately. So that is a budgeted 23 expense, one of those one-time expenses for us to get that plan done this year that would then inform the 24 budget. And then again, yeah, just reviewing all department budgets as we start this 24 cycle coming up quickly. It's already April, so we'll be jumping into that soon. And that's the end of the presentation. So happy to take any other questions or loop back to something that council would like to discuss in more detail.
Council have any questions on our options? And I agree with Councilmember Rose that the revelation was tonight that in the past, we've only dealt with the current year's budget without forecasting things, and that could be really problematic. So here we are in April, before we get to November. Going to 24, going to 25, some of us will be here, others won't, others will replace us. Councilmember Burbank.
Okay, so one of the things that I remember was mentioned, I don't remember which meeting, was when we were talking about ARPA money. And I believe it was you, city administrator, that mentioned to Amy Boucher, maybe that,
Yeah.
just asking about funds that we've already kind of set aside for
Yeah.
those things, but that it doesn't necessarily have to be used towards that.
Right.
And so I just want to make sure that I don't see that in here as an option, and just want to make sure that that's not something that we're looking at right now, correct?
By an option, what would?
Like that it's in here to help, like, take more ARPA money to balance the budget.
It is an option
under
under
which-
the.
We didn't call it out specifically,
It
but it
so
would be the one
included
time.
In the general fund balance.
Mhm.
We did put ARPA in, but it might have been an overdraft though. So part of the general fund balance on that page 13 includes ARPA dollars. So, I mean, the dollars are all more or less the same, but that is certainly in the general fund, so they can be used for any purpose.
Okay.
One option is, so we will still have this deficit of 455,000. So in addition to closing the gap using the tools that we've identified, it will be up to council to decide how you want to further decrease that gap. Do you want to use one-time general funds, which is for reporting purposes, ARPA would be
Easiest
it's
reporting.
the easiest reporting to use it for loss and recovery. And so when we decide to using the small businesses or the nonprofit or the agreement with White River,
Mhm.
when they were performing a role on behalf of the city, the reporting becomes much more cumbersome for city staff. So the ARPA dollars can be used, and they're right now in the same place as the general fund. And I believe that our balance is, or
around-
did you include it?
No,
You know where you included it? It was on this.
400 at the bottom.
Yeah, 400.
yeah.
Okay, so it's on the one-time options of the memo.
Yeah.
One-time options is remaining ARPA funds. We have 400,000. That's the reconciled balance. And that is based off of no additional spending outside of what council already budgeted for this year.
And that would include, that would include the nonprofits, that's remaining amount for the
businesses.
small businesses, the senior center and the White River, those pieces we accounted for as kind of spent so that it wasn't part of the balance. So that 400's after
But there
that.
were many other things
Yes.
that were
That-
identified,
that's
like the
not-
wayfinding, facade improvements, additional improvements for the senior center that had not officially been budgeted and allocated.
Yeah.
And so it's that second pot of dollars that
Mhm.
weren't included in this year's budget that we're considering non-allocated yet.
Okay.
And so that is where we got that $400,000 reconciled balance. And then an additional 100,000, because we had to use general fund dollars this year, one-time dollars to balance the general fund. There is a potential for us to see $100,000 in cost savings between transferring some of the fire positions over more into EMS as well as the passport revenue. So the combined total of that, we hope to be in $100,000 more in the general fund than what the budget originally anticipated. So that
If
would
we
be
started-
500,000 in ARPA dollars. And then we also have the cumulative reserve fund, which is a 5 million current fund balance. We looked historically, it looks like our general fund has always carried about $1 million,
Roughly plus or minus. Yeah.
plus or minus a little. And so we would be hesitant to say, let's go much below that. And the reason for that is that we receive all of our funds, as Sandy had mentioned, at different times of the year. So we need to make sure we're always carrying a healthy amount of cash there, so that we can make it through the off months, because you don't necessarily know when different vendors are going to cash checks or,
Yes.
There's been a lot of information presented tonight, a lot of options. Again, this is April, and I don't expect us to solve this tonight. There's a lot of things to look at, and I know where my preferences are at this point without studying a little further. But I actually, this is April, 18th? I actually appreciate that this is coming up now. I think it's responsible. And again, it's services that we're delivering in light of the anticipated revenue. In a perfect world, we would have businesses thriving and this wouldn't be a thing. But here we are, Councilmember Burbank.
I was just gonna add that, my preference or opinion is that as a council, our priority is to reduce cost and increase revenue as much as possible before we take anything to the voters. I don't think going to the voters and asking them to pay more money is that's not our due diligence. It's to reduce cost, increase revenue, looking at creative options before we go to the voters to ask them to pay any more money. That's just my opinion.
Councilmember Green.
I agree with that. And also, I know it's outside the scope of the recommendations, the toolbox in here, but earlier we discussed briefly kind of the economic development piece of this. I'd like to have more discussions on that and kind of see what other cities have done to support their local businesses and draw in more businesses. I think we made some good steps towards that with the sign code and the parking code and the upcoming impact fee discussion, but there's got to be more we could do to get that more long-term fix going.
I would agree with that. And we're sitting here in 2023. Things are different than they've ever been. And going forward, this is a good start off point to think differently, outside the box. And again, nobody in this town is going to accept a different level of service than they've been getting. They get great service. They're not going to accept anything less than that, nor should they. Other comments, questions, Councilmember Rosano?
Is there a breakout of like which department has a deficit in? Does that make sense? So is like parks is 200,000, fires 100,000, or you just say there's a $600,000 in the general fund? You don't actually show a line item of where we're losing.
No, we don't. Yeah, and the general fund revenue isn't assigned to departments where you look at, oh, this revenue belongs to this department and then, see how much revenue they have per department against their expenses. It doesn't really align that way because some departments don't necessarily generate revenue. Finance doesn't generate any revenue. So we'd be 100% in the deficit because we don't do anything to generate revenue. So the general fund is usually looked at as a whole.
For cost recovery, though, like for Parks and
That-
Rec
for
or
some
for
areas.
development services, that's certainly part of that analysis.
Yeah.
And there's financial policies that council can adopt. For example, we don't go below 85% or 100% even cost recovery in our development services, which means that we look at our permit costs to make sure that they're fully on the developer or that it is subsidized by the general fund. That's
Right.
part of economic development. And so it can go either way.
Mhm.
But we haven't done that analysis yet. We intend to for development services and for parks this year.
Yeah. Yes, for those, there are some areas, yes, they do, but a lot of the general fund is
Yeah, not.
not. So,
Other questions and comments?
I have one.
Councilman or Director Hines, rather.
Yeah, I'll be on this side.
Yes.
So I wanted to say that the forecast will be something that will be continually updated and you will see going forward forevermore. as long as I'm here. So I will update it. And when we get closer, like you said, it is April. It is for me, the very tip and start of budget season. And getting ready to then work with the departments on that. So it will be updated again kind of during the budget season, just that that way we can see how things are going for 23 and update based on more actuals, especially if something's either spiked or valleyed more than we were expecting and what that could do to a future year. But this will be something that will always be updated couple times a year, especially more towards this early time of each year in order to inform council. Here is what the expected deficit kind of going forward is, so that council can be looking at the toolbox and thinking about that and giving direction to staff ahead of budget of how you want us to balance the budget. Do you want us to raise revenue, cut expenses, use the one-time revenue, so that when staff gets to developing their budget and we will look at, I'm doing revenue for, projections, we know where council's priorities are and what tools you want us to use. Much more proactive than bringing you a budget that already says, here's a deficit. It's, August, September, October. What do we want to do really quickly? We don't want to be in that position, in that boat anymore. So this will be something that you will see going forward, and hopefully that it's helpful for you.
And as a positive spin, we do have a very healthy reserve, healthier than I'd say many cities. And we do have a healthy balance in our general fund. We did not spend all of our ARPA dollars. So we do have the benefit of some time that we don't necessarily have to rush out to the voters because we're faced with no other options or having to decrease costs. And so internally and with the directors, we're all very committed right now to trying to find innovative ways to increase revenue and making sure that we're reviewing all of our expenditures, and we'll keeping you involved in that process and keeping the forecast system going so that we can continue to plan.
Yeah.
It's appreciated.
So,
Thank you.
and anytime that you have ideas or have questions or whatever, please, submit them
Yeah.
so that we can, research them and
ideas.
now, or ideas or things that you hear from other cities, from your,
Yeah.
colleagues as well.
Yeah.
Is always appreciated. So we will be bringing back, probably not too far out in the future, discussing budget again so that we can get some council direction on, now that you've seen this, digested it, looked at the tools and stuff, what are your, or our priorities of how going forward to complete balancing that $455,000 deficit that we see in scenario 1. So.
Any other comments or questions? I would just ask that we all think about what we heard tonight when we come back together. I agree with my colleague, Councilmember Burbank, that I'm not going to ask the voters to, it's the last resort, to do a levy lid lift. Sales tax is another thing that I don't think should be off the table. We have some of the lowest sales tax around already. And anyway, let's just think critically about this stuff when we come back so we can do what's best for our community. Anything else? Seeing none, this will conclude the April 18th Buckley City Council special session at 7:19 p.m.
I think I got through this.